On the 11th of April 2015, a historic meeting took place between Raul Castro, the president of Cuba, and Barack Obama. It was celebrated in Panama, and it was the first bilateral meeting of the US and Cuban presidents in 50 years. 4 months earlier, both leaders had announced they would remake relations between the two governments.
Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba.
And as they said they would do, so was done. In just a short period of time, the first changes were made and relations between both countries started to return to normal. Now, it does seem like we say this a lot on this channel, but the arrival of Donald Trump to the White House, well, it changed everything. Again. The new president of the United States has ordered that the US steps back from most of the changes that Obama initiated with Cuba. So the question might be, why is he doing this? What does he expect? And what are the consequences of this new policy? We're going to look at all of these questions in this video, but before we do, let's have a quick look at the history of the relations between these two countries.
The embargo.
After the so-called Cuban Revolution took place against Batista's dictatorship, the new government in the islands, led by Fidel Castro, soon started to nationalize every kind of capital good and company. Land, hotels, factories, well, everything was up for grabs by the government. So the Cuban Revolution ended on the 1st of January 1959, and already by May, the government had begun huge expropriations all across the country. Now, as you might probably be able to imagine, this is something that the US did not really take very well. There were thousands of lawsuits filed in the US which had close relations with Cuba at the time. Further, if this wasn't enough to upset the US, the Soviet Union was already getting on well with Fidel Castro.
It was at this moment when, as a penalty, Washington passed the first trade embargo against the island, an embargo that slowly grew stronger as the relations between these countries were getting worse.
In fact, after the missile crisis of 1962, Kennedy even limited US travel to Cuba. Since then, and with the exception of short periods of better relations under the governments of Ford and Carter, the various governments of the United States have kept the embargo and the policy of isolating Cuba economically in place. Ronald Reagan labeled the island as a sponsor of terrorism, and later Bill Clinton made even more severe restrictions, and the embargo was put into law. Since then, traveling to Cuba, investing in Cuba, or doing business with the Cuban government has been very limited for Americans. Well, that is, until Barack Obama came to office.
In February 2008, Fidel passed power to his brother Raul Castro. That same year, elections took place, and Obama said it was time to use a different approach with Cuba. It was time to improve diplomatic relations between the two countries.
Obama didn't want to wait, and shortly after he arrived in the White House, he softened some of the restrictions that were in place on Cuba. For example, he allowed Cubans in the US to send money to the island, and he started to allow US citizens to travel to Cuba. Many more things followed these first gestures. During the years Obama was in office, many restrictions against Cuba were reduced. And in December of that year, Raul Castro and Obama met in Panama. Significant progress was being made.
But I think what we have both concluded is that we can disagree with a spirit of respect and civility, and that over time it is possible for us to turn the page and develop a new relationship between our two countries.
And that is how two great moments took place. In 2015, the embassies reopened in both countries, and in March of 2016, Air Force One landed in Havana for the first time in history. Cuba hadn't hosted a sitting American president since 1928.
Policy of isolation designed for the Cold War made little sense in the 21st century. The embargo was only hurting the Cuban people instead of helping them. It's time to lift the embargo. It is time now for us to leave the past behind. It is time for us to look forward to the future together. Un futuro de esperanza.
Obama's new policies towards Cuba were taking over, and even though the embargo laws were technically still in force, the Obama administration managed to find legal loopholes to allow the relations between these two countries to be something close to normal. When Obama left the White House, Americans could travel freely to Cuba, immigrants could send unlimited money back to the country, American companies could invest in Cuba, and even planes of American companies frequently landed at Jose Marti International Airport. The new relationship, well, it was working. But then Donald Trump became president of the United States, and as we already mentioned, everything changed.
Trump and Cuba.
On the 16th of June 2017, Trump decided to take this new policy back, and he did so in a neighborhood of Miami called Little Havana.
Effective immediately, I am canceling the last administration's completely one-sided deal with Cuba.
As soon as he finished his speech, Trump signed guidelines for his so-called new policy with Cuba, but after a 50-year embargo with the country, it could hardly be described as actually being new.
Trump won't completely reverse Obama's policies. Many will be maintained. For example, the opening of embassies and the commercial flights between the two countries.
However, from now on, trips of Americans to Cuba will be limited. They won't be able to go individually, and any relationship with GAISA, a holding group directed by the government, which controls more than 50% of the Cuban economy, will be forbidden. But don't think that Trump has always had this hardline attitude towards Cuba. Quite the opposite, in fact. In 1998, he tried to build a hotel on the island, contradicting the embargo, and at the beginning of 2016, he supported Obama's new policies towards the country. But here at VisualPolitik, we think that Trump's attitude towards Cuba, well, it could be a mistake. So let's have a look at exactly why.
Trump's mistake?
Let's make one thing really clear right now. The embargo against Cuba has been a total failure.
The U.S. embargo, which has blocked all trade and investment with Cuba for the past 55 years, has not worked. It has failed to isolate the Cuban government, failed to regain any nationalized property, and succeeded in giving an excuse to the Castro government for its abuses and economic mismanagement.
For more than 50 years, the embargo has been completely useless. It hasn't accomplished anything, and on top of that, the Cuban government has used it as an excuse to justify their poor economic situation. But wait just a second here, because this is not the end of it, not even close. Reversing Obama's policies is a mistake for several reasons. Importantly, improved relations with the US have meant better security for the United States. Obama signed several important cooperation agreements, and since 2015, Cuban authorities have given information on drug and human trafficking to the US. And on the other hand, Russia and China have also set their eyes on the island again.
Russia says it may reopen Soviet-era military bases in Cuba.
You can probably imagine what a blow for national security of the United States this would be. This is why making relations more difficult means nothing more than forcing the Cuban government to seek better relations with Moscow or Beijing. Not exactly a brilliant option for the US. And there is so much more. Trump's new policy will only damage the interests of many American companies, as well as put at risk the major changes that are taking place on the island.
How is Cuba changing?
Since Raul Castro came to power, he has admitted that Cuba needs a change of direction and that the Cuban model simply is not working. Some people are saying that he wants to emulate China, be open to the world, but maintain control. The truth is that up until now, changes have been scarce and slow, but even so, these changes could be felt. And now that Venezuela can no longer help the island, these changes have become more and more urgent. So now let's have a look at what's been happening since 2011, when reforms took place and freelance entrepreneurship was made a lot easier. Since 2011, the number of self-employed workers in Cuba is 4 times larger, and today the number exceeds 500,000 workers. The government has also allowed private farming for small farmers, and restaurants and small tourism businesses are growing and spreading across the country. And Obama's openness, well, it certainly helped this process. For example, almost all private businesses in Cuba are working off money coming in from abroad. Airbnb already has 22,000 apartments, homes, or rooms available in Cuba. Further, we shouldn't forget about less tangible things like the exchange of ideas, mutual knowledge, and the strengthening of the private sector.
Every dollar left in the hands of cab drivers, hotel workers, waitresses, and valets is a show of what awaits Cubans if they reject socialism. U.S. Senator Rand Paul.
Take a look at China and compare the country as it is today to the country it was during Mao's time. Since the country opened itself up to the world, hundreds of millions of people have left poverty behind. Yes, China, like Cuba, it's still a terrible dictatorship, but thanks to their open policy, the Chinese have today more freedom and a better standard of living than they've ever had before. The short of the matter is that the embargo policy, well, it's failed, and Trump's insistence in going back to it is not going to achieve anything but the weakening of security in the United States, lead to further poverty in Cuba, and prevent the changes that are happening on the island. In February of 2018, Castro is going to leave power, and this is not the moment for the US to take a step back. In order to justify his decision, Trump says he wants to defend human rights, which is nice, but don't you think it's a bit hypocritical to defend Cuba's embargo while at the same time he hugs the leaders of Saudi Arabia? I mean, are human rights not important there? Importantly, 10 Republicans have also criticized this course change with Cuba.
Any policy change that diminishes the ability of Americans to travel freely to Cuba is not in the best interests of the United States or the Cuban people. U.S. Senator Jeff Flake.
But now we'd really love to know what you think. Please leave us your comments below and feel free to answer the survey. Should Donald Trump reverse Obama's policies towards Cuba? So I really hope you did enjoy this video, and please do hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We've got brand new videos every Monday and every Thursday, and don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that are not mine, and as always, I'll see you in the next video.
Obama, Obama, so nice you came to Havana.
That's a beautiful song. Thank you so much. You guys are playing dominoes.